Hello everyone and welcome to the opening of the first International Electronic Conference on Animals, which is entitled Global Sustainability and Animals, Science, Ethics and Policy, which is organized by MDPI and the Animals Journal. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we will have two speaker presentations. First, Professor Clive Phillips from Queensland Government Animal Welfare Advisory Board from Australia, which is a bit late there already, and Professor Donald Broom from the University of Cambridge in the UK. After each speaker presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So if you're joining us live, please post your questions in the Q&A box that should be below in the Zoom window. And please submit the questions at any time in the Q&A box. And as we have more than one speaker today, address your question to the speaker. So mention the name of the speaker together with your question. I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be available soon at the conference webpage. And now we will start with Professor Clive Phillips from Queensland Government Animal Welfare Advisory Board. And I hand the floor to him. So please, thank you again, everyone, to join us today and enjoy the webinar.
Well, welcome everybody to the conference, which is an important development, an important milestone in the animals MDPI venture, a venture which has seen a major journal develop over the last 10 years. And sorry, I'm just getting my first slide up. I'm now with Curtin University, and I'm going to talk to you about the future options for the role of livestock in food security. And one of the trends which we are seeing worldwide is for animals to be housed more intensively, and so I've entitled it Will the Cows Come Home? Just to outline my talk, which will be for the next 45 minutes, we are going to talk about growth in meat output worldwide, and then some of the concerns that this brings, the pollution issues, the transmission of diseases, the genetic diversity loss. We're going to talk a little bit about the overall suffering that we see in the world today and the contribution that intensive livestock are making to that. And then at the end, we'll talk about alternatives, focusing on clean meat, meat that is produced in a laboratory and not from a live animal, and other alternatives such as protein that can be produced from insects. So let's start by just having a look at the meat production worldwide and how that's changed from 1961 to 2018. And you can see this charted here for the different species. And you'll see obviously that there is overall an increase in meat production, a very considerable increase. In fact, it's multiplied by a factor of some 6 times or so. But the biggest growth has been in the poultry sector. You can see the blue line at the bottom, and also very significant growth in the pig meat sector. But all the sectors have increased, and this has been in response to both population growth, but also in response to growing demand for meat to be consumed by individuals. So increasing meat consumption, particularly in some developing parts of the world and especially in Asia. The meat production is focused on just some specific countries, and we can see that the dark red countries here are those with the highest meat output. And 3 countries stand out as being preeminent in meat production in the world today. The first is China, which produces over 50% of the world's pig production. And then we have Brazil, producing a very large proportion of poultry production, and the USA, very prominent again in pig production and in chicken production. Now, part of the requirement for increased requirement for meat has come from the population growth. And we can see this here charted both up until the present day, where we're standing at about 7.5 billion people, and then the predicted increase to about 2100, where it should begin to level off. But this is obviously going to place increased demand for meat to be supplied. And the line here on the graph shows the population growth rate. So we know that is already declining quite rapidly, and hence the forecasted peak population growth. And so we can talk about the world's stable population at about 2100, but we can also talk about how meat production may increase up to a peak level, and then for a number of reasons which I will describe, will later decline. So that concept of peak beef, for example, is a fairly novel one, and one that we may come back to at a later stage. So what are the concerns that the growth in meat production is causing worldwide? One is the significant use of land for the production of crops to feed the animals. The land use efficiencies in even the most efficient animal production systems are for energy no more than a quarter of the amount of energy that could be produced directly if the land is used to produce crops for human food. And the most efficient would be dairy. Just under a quarter of the amount of energy can be produced if you have to go through the dairy cow. And with poultry, it's less efficient. With beef and sheep, it's very much less efficient. So large areas of land are having to be used to feed the livestock. And at a time of growing, still rapidly growing world population, it is putting pressure on food security. If we consider protein, the ratio is not quite as great. So approximately half the amount of protein can be produced by growing crops for livestock, as opposed to using them directly for human consumption. In the most efficient systems, again, dairy and poultry, again, much less efficient for beef and sheep. Protein is probably the more relevant consideration because energy is freely available from the sun, and what we do to the food after growing it, either as an animal or as a crop directly for human consumption, what we do to the food will change the energy energy usage very considerably. If we make a piece of toast, for example, using bread that has been manufactured, then we are adding a considerable amount of energy. So the energy equation is not quite as relevant. So how is this additional meat being produced from chicken and beef, for example? We can see that Brazil has very rapidly increased its exports, both for chicken and beef, and part of that has been achieved by changing rainforest into areas that are growing soybean in particular, maize, for intensive chicken production. And there is a blueprint for intensive production that is followed worldwide. So it's not necessarily that their production systems are any more or less efficient. So to allow for that increased production, we have seen a very rapid increase in maize and soybean production. The milk products trade has also increased very rapidly, particularly that for cheese. One of the big growth markets, of course, over the last 20 or 30 years has been in fast food. And part of that is the trade in pizzas. The consumption of pizzas has increased very rapidly, requiring large amounts of cheese to be used to produce the pizzas. Whereas, for example, skim milk powder, which was often produced from surplus milk and is then used for baby food and for calf food, has not increased to any great extent. We've also seen enormous growth in aquaculture production, because although many people now recognize that some of the animal products, some of the land animal products that we consume are not good for our health necessarily, and are using inordinate amounts of land to produce them. The consumption of fish oils is generally reckoned to be good for our health, particularly those containing omega-3 fatty acids. And there has been continued growth of fish, and it's been transitioning very much from fish which are produced, which are harvested from the sea, to fish which are grown in agricultural production systems. Preeminent amongst the countries, as well as Norway and Chile, there's been a massive growth in aquaculture in the East and Southeast Asian countries. China has the biggest aquacultural systems in the world, and they have significant welfare impacts. They will usually transport their animals to restaurants alive, because the Chinese like to eat their fish very fresh. So they transport it to the restaurants alive and then selected and slaughtered at restaurants, rather than being slaughtered after the harvest and then transported on ice to restaurants. So the predicted growth in global meat and milk production gives us some really quite scary statistics, in that the FAO predicted way back in 2011 that meat and milk production would have to double over the first half of the current century. And for that reason, we've seen continued investment in intensive production, and more countries expanding their intensive animal production systems. One of the impacts of that is to put pressure on some of the staple food production for humans. And I worry that there will be inadequate staple foods, particularly at a time of growing income inequality in many parts of the world, in Asia, in the United States, in Europe, in many of those countries. Income inequality has grown to unprecedented levels. So the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and it's quite likely that we will see challenges to food security based on the ability of those rich people to buy the meat that they wish to consume, with inadequate land available to produce the staple human food from cereals. A country that is self-sufficient in producing meat, but one which actually exports meat. And I believe this is very much where China positions itself. It has very rapidly growing intensive animal production systems. I visited dairies there just within the last few years where there are 30,000 cows. Now, only a few decades ago, a dairy farm in most parts of the world with 100 cows was a large farm. So these are very, very large industrial scale production systems. And the same with some of the very large poultry units and pig units. We're seeing unprecedented growth, and very often in developing parts of the world, and some of them where the countries themselves are really not suited to extensive pasture production. Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, tropical and subtropical regions of the world are really not suited to converting their rainforest to pasture land, and we could put Brazil into that category as well. So that again brings further inefficiency. And most of the growth in meat production is actually happening in the developing countries, and it's happening in poultry and pork production systems, as we can see in this graph here. So the pork in developing countries at the bottom in the green, and the poultry in developing countries in the brown on the top right. And the growth in demand is also regionalized, occurring very much in Asia and the Pacific region, and to some extent in Latin America. And we're all well aware of the economic changes which have happened in Asia, particularly in China, which have meant that people are now much more able to afford to consume meat. And they have, in adopting a more of a free market policy, I think, turned towards a Western style diet, which is more meat focused. Ironically, at a time when many in Western countries are now beginning to reduce their meat consumption because they are aware of some of the problems associated with using very large areas of land for production of meat. There have been a lot of free trade agreements which have meant that meat is now very much an international commodity, whereas it used to be produced on a more regional scale. European partner agreements with Africa and Caribbean and Pacific countries, European Union agreements with Brazil, Chile, Switzerland, etc., and then a lot of bilateral agreements, particularly Australia with China, although that, of course, is quite under threat at the moment, and some Australian beef production is being boycotted by China. But these, one of the big changes since the 1960s has been the freeing up of the international markets so that these commodities are exchanged much more freely and without the tariffs that hindered exchange previously. It doesn't always work. There have been, of course, a number of trade wars. Australian beef exports to Indonesia about 7 or 8 years ago were curtailed due to political issues. Our exports to China from Australia are being threatened at the moment. From a more historical basis, the UK had wars over cod wars, where there were challenges to the UK's right to fish in Icelandic waters. Japanese whaling, another issue, and sometimes you get, it becomes a very political issue. So McDonald's in Russia, for example, in Moscow, was symptomatic of the problems which were facing the exchange of meat products between the European Union and Russia. And the Russian population, after the fall of communism, saw it as a great advance to have McDonald's open, but only for it to be closed later on when Russia wanted to take retaliatory action against the European Union. So that's some of the issues surrounding the growth in meat production and some of the problems in terms of utilization of large tracts of land. But one of the biggest areas which is most concerning, I think, in relation to meat production at the moment is the impact that and the contribution that it is making towards climate change and towards more localized pollution. The pollution is coming from production of fertilizer, from methane gas produced directly from ruminant animals, cattle and sheep, and from the distribution of manure onto the land. These are all polluting the atmosphere with some greenhouse gases, in particular methane and nitrous oxide, and contributing between 15 and 20% of this total greenhouse gas production. It has been said that the greenhouse gas contribution of livestock is greater than all the world's transport vehicles at the moment. So that's a pretty sobering statistic. And Ondine Sherman, in her recent book, Vegan Living, stated very clearly that we cannot both save the planet from a climatic perspective and continue to eat meat at the rate in which we're doing. We're also transporting nutrients around the globe. This shows the transport of nitrogen from the United States in the form of exported animals. So that is, again, a concern. And in terms of the pollution potential, the long distance transport may not necessarily always lead to the greatest amount of pollution. Milk production, which is transported from New Zealand to the European Union, for example, may actually be less polluting than using milk which is produced in Sweden and Holland, because the industries are much more intensive in Sweden and Holland and less based on pastoral production. So the global warming potential in terms of kilograms of carbon dioxide per litre of milk is substantially less in New Zealand than it is in Holland, for example. The eutrophication, the pollution of rivers with phosphates and acidification are also less in New Zealand, as well as the energy utilization, because it is pasture-based. Another very serious concern, particularly in these COVID days, when we know that the most recent pandemic outbreak stemmed from the use of animals for food in China, has been the spread of diseases. And perhaps a more traditional example would be the spread of foot and mouth disease, which produces new serotypes on a fairly regular basis in India. And these spread east and west and can be charted progressing through those countries in just the same way that the influenzas which develop in animal production systems in China can also be seen to travel around the human population on an annual basis. Ticks and tick-borne fevers similarly emanating from livestock in Central Africa and spreading north and south. And this is raising very serious concern. And the previous pandemics also originated from animals. The Spanish flu in 1918 came from chickens originally, and the 58-59 influenza outbreak, which killed about 1.5 million people. Not as bad as the Spanish flu, and probably not going to be as bad as COVID-19 will end up being, but still, again, produced from livestock. So the way in which we're keeping our livestock increasingly gives concerns for the transmission of diseases. And it seems quite clear that the COVID-19 came originally from bats and was transmitted via livestock, via wildlife, which were taken to wet markets. And the origin of the COVID-19 in bats, I believe, is likely to have been supported by the pressure that humans put on the bat populations in China. Humans are living very close to those bat populations, and you can see it on a regular basis around the world. Bats are very much under pressure. Close to where I live, trees have been taken down because people don't want to live close to fruit bats. They're noisy, they're messy, and potentially are transmitting disease. So as the human population is expanding, the bat population is coming under pressure, and that puts pressure on their immune system, which makes the bats themselves more susceptible to diseases. Another concern about the way in which we are changing our livestock production industries is the loss of biodiversity. The domestication of animals started 10,000 years ago or so, and a large number of breeds developed which provided opportunities for using domesticated animals in many different scenarios. But what we've done is we've concentrated those resources in just a few genotypes. In chickens, for example, there are just 6,000 great-grandparents of all the birds that are produced, some 75% of world egg output. And just 15,000 meat chickens are the foundation stock for the world's production of chickens. Chickens themselves make up, depending on which source you use, between 10 and 20% of the total world bird population. And that is increasingly the case, that as wildlife declines, we are increasing the number of domesticated animals used for meat, which is very dangerous. The loss of biodiversity means that if we change our direction in the future, supposing we don't want to use so much grain for feeding to livestock, we don't want to use them to feed to cattle, for example, we have selected those genotypes. The Frisian dairy cow is a very good example. We've selected those genotypes which need large amounts of high quality feedstuff, and this means that the other breeds will simply not be available if we want to change direction to a more sustainable future. We've also changed the genotype very considerably, and the best example, as I'm sure you're well aware, is the meat chicken, which has now grown to its 2 kilogram slaughter weight in 30 to 35 days, whereas just 50 or 60 years ago, it would take twice that long. Not only that, we have to sustain that high level of growth by feeding the animals high levels of grain, as I've just indicated, but the food conversion efficiency is so important to the poultry industry that we have to feed them on a routine basis antibiotics, which is jeopardizing the use of antibiotics to humans, because using them in such large quantities by including them in chicken feed and pig feed is producing antibiotic resistance, which could be transferred to humans. A very real issue, as antibiotic resistance is going to mean we do not have the benefit of those antibiotics to control those very diseases which livestock are assisting in spreading around the world. We are also expanding our transfer of live animals between countries, particularly chicken and pigs. And I've just here listed the export number in 1961 and how that's grown up to 2018. And we can see that there's been a 5.5% year-on-year growth in chickens that are exported around the world, pigs over a 5% growth, and then the other species, it's quite a bit less. And this is because we have not only expanded our meat production, we have focused on chickens and pigs, those very species which use all the cereals and the intensive grain requirements which are needed for human consumption. So whereas there might be an argument that in some parts of the world on land that is used for cattle and sheep production and is under pasture could be used for little else, that argument cannot be made with producing food for chicken and pigs. And even then, I believe that most of the pasture land that is used for raising cattle and sheep could be used very sensibly for alternative and much more efficient food production. So that expansion in live export gives considerable concern for the welfare of animals, because transporting animals halfway around the world, for example, from Australia to the Middle East, Australia to Russia, Australia to China, so these animals are nearly all transported by ship, and the ship journeys are 30 to 40 days long, quite commonly, and the welfare of the animals on board ship is not good. So it is leading to increased animal suffering. But there are many other reasons why I believe the number of animals suffering at the moment and the scale of the suffering is increasing at quite an alarming rate. This might be contrary to what you would imagine if you listen to some of the advocacy groups that might be saying, well, you know, we're doing a good job, we're trying to control the amount of animal suffering, we're winning this battle, we've had this gain, chickens are no longer kept in cages, etc. But if we look at the expansion of world meat and milk consumption, it's clear that many more animals are being raised in intensive animal production systems where their welfare is inherently worse than in some of the extensive systems. There is more reliance on small animals, chickens and pigs, compared with cattle. And so many more animals are having to be grown. There is increased live trade, as I've just said, and a lot of the animals are now being produced in developing countries which don't necessarily have the animal welfare standards that, for example, are enforced in the European Union, which have undoubtedly some quite stringent animal welfare standards. Let's look at alternatives. In vitro meat, is that really on the cards? We've heard talk of meat being produced in laboratories, and you only have to go into a fast food chain now and you can see plant-based alternatives. But it is now quite feasible to grow meat in a laboratory rather than producing it from a live animal. The futurists have predicted that within 10 years, we will be eating in vitro meat, which is grown not in farms, but in laboratories, in just the same way that the very rapid change is coming in other sectors of society, electric cars, driverless cars, etc. The pace of change in society is truly staggering. Now, is this just fanciful to consider we'll be eating meat grown in laboratories? I don't believe it is. The energetic efficiency is vastly greater than you see in farm animals. And this is because you're not having to produce all the extra parts of the animal that are not consumed. Typically, only 50% of a carcass is actually consumed. And you're not having to sustain an animal which is walking around for quite a long period of time as a homeotherm, as an animal that is generating a lot of heat. So the energetic efficiency is very much greater. And this means that large amounts of land could be released. And it has been said that we can now manipulate the way in which meat is produced genetically in laboratories, and this will in fact form the second wave of domestication of animals. We'll be using animal cells and manipulating so that they not only grow efficiently, but they produce meat which has a better quality for human consumption. It could have added vitamins, added minerals, less saturated fat, for example, and therefore be more healthy to consume. So why should we be interested in vitro meat? What are the public concerns about meat produced from farm animals? Well, there's the obvious environmental impact. I've talked about that. Greenhouse gases, nitrogen and phosphorus overloading in the watercourses and pollution of the watercourses. But we've also got the ethical concerns. The fact that animals can't perform natural behavior. There are welfare concerns, dehorning of cattle, which is done without anesthetic in Australia, for the most part, long distance transport, a couple of really important issues for their welfare. Restriction of the natural lifespan of animals as well is an ethical concern. The inefficient use of the natural resources, especially energy, when the world population is still expanding very rapidly. And then we've got the health impact, with meat consumption being directly linked by medical scientists to obesity, cardiovascular disease, and some cancers, particularly of the the gastrointestinal tract. We've got the growth in zoonoses. Now, in vitro meat is not a new idea. Winston Churchill claimed back in 1932, 50 years hence we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium. Well, he was a bit wrong with his time frame, but the concept was undoubtedly right. The first muscle cells were grown back in 1971, and culturing of animal stem cells began to really gather pace in the 1990s. And then, particularly in Holland and the USA, patents began to be filed for producing meat in this way. And the first edible samples were produced in 2002, very famously in Holland. And turkey cells began to be cultured 2006. Leather can now be cultured artificially, and the first lab-grown beef burger produced in Holland in 2013. Now, the way we understand, the way we know that the big companies are taking cultured meat very, very seriously is because some of the big beef-producing companies are investing heavily in vitro meat. And there are now about 30 labs working on the cultured meat. The technique works. It is currently just expensive at the moment, particularly because it has to be kept abiotic, but these problems are solvable. And one of the leading fast food outlets said that by November of this year, so this month, we should be seeing some artificially grown chicken nuggets available for sale in the fast food outlets. So it's grown by extracting tissue from a living animal by biopsy, and adding growth serum, adding a scaffold, and then giving some exercise in terms of movement so the muscle cells grow, and then if necessarily adding flavors, ions, vitamins to make the healthy product for people to eat. So the technique definitely works. Now, one of the key issues is the public perception of in vitro meat. Who is going to eat this? Is it going to be eaten by the public at large? City dwellers tend to be more positive. The comments are generally positive. There are benefits perceived in terms of public health and environmental benefits, but one of the problems is it is still seen as unnatural. I would argue that producing beef in a feedlot is very unnatural. But people do believe it has unappealing qualities. There are concerns about safety and also about feasibility. Surveys in Belgium and Holland have shown that most people will try the in vitro meat, but it has that same sort of connotation as genetic engineering. So there are concerns about price sensitivity. People are unwilling to pay more than a conventional meat, but they do want to reduce waste and they want to reduce animal suffering. It's also seen as more efficient. What about potential consumers outside of Europe? Have they got similar opinions? We've done some surveys of meat consumers in the US. One survey had 673 representative respondents. Now, the people that are most likely to be receptive to the in vitro meat are men rather than women, politically liberal respondents. Vegetarians and vegans, on the other hand, are more likely to perceive the benefits, but less likely to try it than the meat eaters. Again, the main concerns are that the meat will be seen as unnatural, the price is anticipated to be high, and there are concerns about taste. But the surveys have shown that the majority of people will try it, and many would be willing to use it to replace farmed meat. What about other alternatives? One of those is using insects as food. This is not entirely new. It's quite a traditional practice, in fact, in Africa, in Asia, and Australia, and the Americas. Grasshoppers, beetles, and ants can all be grown in large quantities, and even wasp, bee, and moth larvae. And in fact, in some Aboriginal communities, these are still consumed. the witchetty grubs are still dug up and consumed, and it's part of Aboriginal culture. The argument is that it's more efficient use of resources than modern animal farming. These are not homeotherms, animals which have to maintain a constant heat output, which utilizes large amounts of energy. They're rich in amino acids. The insect coat is, the chitin is full of amino acids, has a lot of iron and zinc in it, and they're much more efficient because they're not homeotherms, and therefore there's less greenhouse gas production. It may well be that it will become part of the staple way of producing human foods, and indeed is quite traditional in Mexico, for example. Problems. Are insects safe to eat? Will diseases be transmissible? Will they develop zoonoses that can be transferred to humans? Will the escaped species threaten the wild species in the same way that farmed fish have contaminated wild fish in the oceans with diseases, with fungal diseases? And what about the welfare of insects? This has been little considered, but the welfare of honeybees, for example, is now beginning to be considered as an important topic. And then there is this disgust factor, which psychologists have studied in relation to in vitro meat. It's very real, and it shows that people find it unpalatable and uncomfortable to consume these products, but dietary habits can change quite rapidly. And the growth of veganism, for example, in Western countries today is very rapid, and is looking to continue that very rapid growth. So to conclude, we need careful consideration in meeting the world's food security needs because of the increasing world population. And I'm seriously worried that the rising animal trade, the rise in animal production will jeopardize world food security. But it's also very important to consider all the ethical aspects in relation to the different options we may consider, the welfare of any animals we are using, the environmental impact, whether the animals are receiving a good life or not, the length of their life, any diseases which might emerge from our use of animals, and how efficient are our food production systems. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer those. I think yes. Eleanor is going to transmit any questions to save me having to find them in Zoom.
Yeah, don't worry. I will read them to you. Actually, there are 2 now and 3 now, actually. So the first one is from Dora Marinova, and she's asking if recent research shows that seaweed added to the cattle's diet reduces methane emissions. Many see this as a breakthrough. How would you comment on this? And thanks for a great presentation, Cliff.
Thank you. Hi, Dora. Seaweed added to the diet of cattle? Was that the question? I didn't quite hear you, Eleanor. Yeah, okay. I've heard of it, but I'm not aware of all the technology which is going on there. I know seaweed has been gathered in the past on the coast of Ireland, for example, to feed to cattle, and is, I think, quite a sensible use of the sea's resources. I'm not aware of its being marketed and used internationally. I myself enjoy a bit of seaweed from time to time. It's got a lot of iodine in, full of minerals, and it is a very healthy product, a lot of alginates, so would generally be quite a healthy product. But the cow, of course, has a very different digestive system to mine, in that it will all go into a rumen. The food goes into a rumen, and the food is digested not by the cow, but by microorganisms. So it may well be that those microorganisms grow faster and support higher growth of the animal if they're given supplementary iodine, for example. Iodine is deficient in many countries, indeed in Ireland, and that's why seaweed is a good food for the Irish to eat, as well as to be gathered from the seashore and fed to cattle, which is a traditional crofting practice.
Thank you. I think that there's another question from Alejandra that it's similar to this, because she asked for the benefits of spirulina protein for human nutrition. That is also
spirulina protein.
Yes.
Again, you caught me out. I mean, I'm a livestock nutritionist and welfare specialist, not a human nutritionist. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that, because
no problem.
Yes, but I do know that our diets are broadening rapidly and very significantly, and I think the pace of change is really quickening. You know, I look back just over my lifetime, and you know, when I was young, I would be taken into the food selling shops. There weren't supermarkets when I was young. I can remember the first supermarkets in my hometown, which was when I was about 7 or 8. Probably shows how old I am. But the first supermarkets were just beginning to be produced, and since then we've seen an internationalization of our diets, which has been very beneficial, and it has meant that we can begin to really think very seriously about what is best for us to eat, and what is most efficient to grow, and what is good for our health. I think when I was young, when my parents, grandparents, etc., were alive, then we were locked into a Northern European, very meat-based diet. It would have been extremely difficult to follow a plant-based diet at that time. Vegetable production was seasonal. So in the wintertime, you know, all those vegetables and fruits which we enjoy year-round, they simply weren't available in the wintertime. It was very seasonal. And so in the wintertime, we would have stored vegetable products, cereals, and meat. And you go back still further, and you find that even in the wintertime, there would be a shortage of meat, because animals had to be killed at the start of the winter because there was not enough fodder to keep them through the winter period. So, you know, our diets have changed immeasurably in the last the last few decades, and I'm old enough to remember the advent of pizzas. Pizzas were not around when I was very young. That might seem incredible to the younger population amongst you, but it's true. You know, in the United Kingdom, pizzas were, you might see them if you travel to Italy, but otherwise, you know, and people didn't travel very much in those days. And so these, what became to be exotic foodstuffs, were simply not available. And so we've seen that enormous change, which has given us great opportunities to improve the efficiency and the value of the foods we eat.
Perfect, thank you. We have, so Justina Zolinska has many questions actually. So the first is, how many biopsies must be performed on live animals to meet the food needs of a growing human population? Are these biopsies painful? Will animals be given painkillers? And how are they going to fertilize the soil without natural fertilizers from animal manure?
How are they not going to fertilize the soil?
How are we going to fertilize the soil without natural fertilizers?
Yes. Okay. In relation to biopsies, I know this is a contentious issue, but the science is changing very rapidly. So the maintenance of cultures is being extended over prolonged periods of time. So it becomes less necessary to perform routine biopsies on animals. The first cultured meats which will be used extensively will undoubtedly be the heavily processed meats. I mentioned the chicken nuggets, but the beef burger is another one which will be quite rapidly replaced, I believe, by cultured meat alternatives. And even now, you can go into a fast food chain and you can buy plant-based burgers, which I cannot distinguish from the meat alternatives. So that I've talked primarily about cultured meats, but there are at the same time being developed a whole range of plant-based alternatives based on peas, soya, mushrooms, a whole range of things, which I think the modern generation, the young generation, are rapidly embracing. So the future of cultured meat will not necessarily be to replace all our meat stocks, but there will be people who want to continue eating meat and are not willing to turn to plant-based alternatives, even if they are very palatable. The predictions which are usually used estimate that by 2050, approximately 40%, between 30 and 40% of our current meat consumption will be replaced by a combination of cultured meat and plant-based alternatives. Now that is a staggering statistic, 30 to 40%. There are two separate institutions that have attempted that prediction. So the second part of the question was about fertilization. We actually take from the land a relatively small amount of harvestable crop that is consumed. And by efficient use of green manuring, we could very easily go back to, with the extra land that is available, we could go back to efficient rotation of crops so that fertilizers are introduced both by nitrogen fixing crops, such as legumes, and also the use of green manures. The old Norfolk forecourse, for example, where there are, on an annual basis, 4 years, there's a rotation of crops from cereals to legumes, etc. And this would mean that there is return of nutrients to the fields, which means that we don't require livestock manures. And let's face it, most livestock manures are not used very efficiently for fertilizing crops nowadays. You know, some countries have trouble getting rid of them livestock manures. Holland, for example, you know, most of the cattle are up in the north, and they have too much livestock manure to put on the land. Pig manure as well, causing quite a lot of problems. So I would have no concerns about efficient rotation of crops, and use of nitrogen fixing crops could provide efficient fertilization, not least because we actually take only a fairly small proportion a small proportion of the crop is actually consumed.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have time for one more. So Justina also is asking if holistic grazing and agroforestry can contribute to DHA reduction and absorption, and if these are welfare systems, shouldn't this be the direction of change? What do you think?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Christina, I think it was.
Justina, I don't know if that's the pronunciation.
Okay. Yes, I didn't mention agroforestry for a number of reasons. One is that agroforestry has proved difficult to manage on a worldwide basis. There are a few countries which manage agroforestry quite well. New Zealand's one, the far south of South America, and quite a few countries in South America have gone down the route of agroforestry. The trouble is our agricultural systems have evolved to be highly intensive and very simple. They've evolved to be very labor efficient, to be competitive. And agroforestry systems, I believe, are difficult to manage, particularly when you start mixing livestock with trees. Now, the agroforestry systems which mix cropping with trees, I think, have more potential. But if you start mixing livestock with trees, well, for a start, we usually underfeed our livestock with fiber. And so you put them in with trees and they start stripping the trees. So there's a potential for a lot of damage to the trees. Nevertheless, it is possible to establish agroforestry systems where you are, for example, grazing sheep or cattle in between, for example, Pinus radiata, pine trees. That can give increased total productivity from the land. But too often, I've seen agroforestry systems where either the livestock or the trees are essentially just a byproduct. And I think it's a problem with the complexity of the system. Our agricultural managers cannot manage such complex systems. Farmers tend to be focused down either a livestock route, they're good at growing animals, or they're good at producing crops. And it can be hard to find systems which combine both very efficiently. So unfortunately, much as I would like to support agroforestry systems, I'm not sure that they have a very clear future. And I also believe that farm animals will be replaced very rapidly, particularly in some of the intensive production systems, by plant-based alternatives and possibly cultured meat. And with that, I'll close.
So perfect. Thank you very much for your talk, Cliff. And there's another question for you. Maybe you can type the answer in the Q&A from
Sure.
Justina as well. And then our next speaker is Professor Donald Broom from University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And I will hand the floor to him. Donald, you can start sharing your screen.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Clive, for that excellent introduction to a very wide-ranging area and a very interesting and exciting area, thinking about what is going to happen in the future. And I'm going to follow on from that and develop some of the ideas that you presented, although I didn't know what you were going to present when I wrote this, and also say something about some of the questions which were put to you. Some of them will come up in the in the talk, and some I can talk about later. So I'm going to say something first of all in a very, very general way about who are we and what is the future for us and for the world. What are the things that need to be changed? What does the public want? What are our obligations in relation to the world we live in? And then say a little bit about what I think the current problems are in the world and the concept of sustainability, which you have raised already. And then I'll just give a few examples of problem areas where there may be interactions between different aspects of sustainability. I'm going to talk particularly about welfare and environmental issues, but to some extent about the others that you raised as well. And how indeed do we evaluate sustainability? How do we score it? And then, having said a little about that, what do we deduce about who has to change and what has to change in the future? And then how long have we actually got to do it? How quickly do we have to change? So the first issue, who are we and do we have a future? There's actually been quite a significant change in the view of humans in relation to other kinds of animals in recent years. There's been a very rapid development of knowledge showing how humans function and how non-human animals function. And the general message from that is that there's much less difference between humans and other species than was previously thought. So this is a significant change in science. It really is a scientific revolution. It's happened fairly gradually, but we do now have a large amount of information talking about the similarities between humans and non-human animals. And when you say to the average person, are humans animals, they sometimes hesitate. But actually, of course, all humans are animals, and every biologist knows this very well. Every veterinarian, every medically qualified person knows this. But there's still a reluctance to think that humans are just one kind of animal, one species of animal. And because of this situation of focusing on humans, there has been a lot of emphasis of short-term human-oriented aims. Well, what do people actually think about it? Well, we know when you ask people in almost every country, what do you think about other various kinds of animals, farm animals, companion animals, wild animals? Most people will say that they think that animals are important and that animal welfare is something which is important. And when in the EU, these quite extensive Eurobarometer surveys have been carried out in every member state of the EU, and you can find that about 90% of people will say, more than 90% will say that animal welfare is something which is important. And they say not just it's important, but it changes how I behave. The fact that I think it's important changes how I behave. And what has been happening is that the range of animals considered to be subjects of moral concern has been increasing. Despite this, it's still the case that most people think humans are so important that all other animals can be exploited, killed, moved around the world in the way you've just heard from Clive Phillips, or indeed made extinct, and that these are things which are not really central moral issues. So for many people, this isn't a major moral issue, but the number of people who think it is increasing. So if we're in a situation where humans are extremely similar to other species, particularly to other sentient animals, then asking that question, which I put at the beginning, who are we? We are not just humans. We are humans and other sentient animals. The concept of we can include more than one species. It can include all sentient animals. And that is, I think, an important change which is gradually going to occur around the world. And this has partly come about because of concepts like one health and one welfare. When you look at diseases, when you look at how to evaluate welfare, you find that we do it in that we evaluate welfare, we investigate health in the same way for humans and non-humans. And the concepts like health, welfare, stress, pain, those words mean exactly the same thing for humans and non-humans. It's not a different meaning according to whether it's a human or not. So the term stress has exactly the same scientific meaning for a human or for a fish like a trout. So overall then, there is only one biology. All the biological processes apply to all animals equally, including to humans and non-humans. And that is starting to change our attitudes. But what do people actually want at the moment? Well, you've heard a fair amount about that from Clive already. You've heard about the problems and you've heard about how people are thinking about it. People are thinking about their own actions, including their purchasing, and they're taking account of the rest of the world and not just human issues. So although there are lots of people thinking thinking about themselves, there is a greater concern about the long-term consequences of all of our actions. And the public who are thinking about what is happening to the world more and getting more information about it. There's a lot of information available now, publicly available. Everybody can get hold of it from the internet, or a high proportion of people in the world can get hold of it. All of these people who are thinking more about the world are actually consumers. So consumers, people are trying to avoid actions and to avoid products that cause harms, and that is changing how things are going in the world. And if people think a little bit less about humans, then that it can be an important thing, even in relation to the survival of our own species. So what people would generally say now is we have obligations to others. We have obligations to other individual humans. We have obligations to to animals with which we interact in any way at all. And it's better, in fact, to talk about obligations than to talk about rights and freedoms. Although there is a similarity in the thinking, it's better to think, what are my obligations, rather than thinking, what are my rights? So we have obligations then not to harm other individuals, to preserve key aspects of the environment. And we have to think about, if we do cause some kind of harm, in what circumstances can that be justified? So if we keep animals, or we interact in any other way with other species, then we do have obligations. And most people would say we have obligations not to cause a lot of suffering, to avoid poor welfare in the animals with which we interact. But also, should we kill them? Should we damage the environment in some way? To what extent should we conserve the environment? And the species which we're talking about here is a picture of the most widespread bird in the world and the commonest farmed animal species at the moment. And they are actually being kept, as you have heard already from Clive Phillips. Often they're being kept in conditions which are very bad for them. You do see very serious welfare problems in the commonest farmed animal. And most of those problems are to do with growing too fast and having inability to walk in the latter part of life, or inability to walk easily without pain. So a high proportion of these animals, the commonest farmed animal in the world, has a substantial amount of pain in the latter part of its life, and other aspects of poor welfare. So does that matter? Do farmed animals matter? Here's a sheep. Is a sheep an individual of consequence? Well, we do now know a great deal about the abilities of these animals. So sheep, for example, we know that sheep can recognize individual sheep, they can recognize individual humans, they can recognize the photographs of individual humans, they can change their behavior according to what is happening, they can learn very sophisticated things, they have a very wide range of feelings, of emotional responses, and these animals are really almost identical with humans in the range of things which happen to them. The same applies to other species. Here is a pig, which this was a study which we did, or we did studies on learning in sheep and in pigs. But one of the pig studies was to put the pigs with a mirror for a while, and then to test them to see if they could use information from a mirror. And 5 hours of experience with a mirror was enough for a pig to be able to use information from a mirror and to know that what it saw in the mirror was on this side of the mirror, not the other side, and at a certain angle to where they were looking. They could use that information. So these are clever animals. So all farm animals, our companion animals, our farm animals, are sentient beings. They're complex in their functioning, and that is something which changes our ideas about obligations. And if it means we think more about the welfare of animals, we ought to think about the welfare of any kind of living animal, but if it's a sentient animal, it has perhaps a wider range of possibilities for suffering. And if we are thinking about animal welfare, if we're thinking about any aspect of sustainability, we need to assess it scientifically. And this has been a major rapid development in the last 30 or 40 years. We now have very good scientific measures of animal welfare. We can work out how good or poor welfare is in different circumstances. Okay, so now what about the problems of the world? Well, what are the biggest problems in the world today? And I would say that for the world in general, that selfish, unplanned human use of world resources leading to harms to animals and plants and reduction in biodiversity and changes like climate change is probably the greatest problem in the world. That's for the world at large. I would say that for humans, the greatest problem in the world is antimicrobial resistance. So we have a situation at the moment where there are lots of bacterial diseases which are being readily treated, and Clive Phillips mentioned this also. So tuberculosis, for example, Is that a serious disease? Well, there are more deaths from tuberculosis every year in the world than all the world COVID-19 deaths so far. So tuberculosis is just one disease, actually more important than COVID-19 in terms of deaths in the world. And there are quite a few other diseases which, if we can't use antimicrobials, antibiotics, there are going to be vast numbers of human deaths. And this is more important than other diseases, things like terrorism, hunger, corruption. These are less important things than a large proportion of the human population being killed by bacterial diseases. The main reason why we have now such an enormous decline in the efficacy of antimicrobials is misuse by humans, misuse of medicines by humans, mainly by the public, but partly by people in the medical profession. And they're changing their views very quickly, the medical profession, but it's still the case that there's widespread sale of antimicrobials, antibiotics to the public in many countries. And the result is that we're getting faster and faster development of resistance, and the pharmaceutical companies are not developing new ones fast enough to replace them. There's also antimicrobial use in plant and animal agriculture. That's also important. Action on that is much faster than the action in terms of human medical use. Okay, so let's go on to the general topic of sustainability. Is a production system sustainable is clearly important, and here's a definition of sustainability. It's to do with whether the system or the procedure is acceptable now, and if what we expect to be its future effects are acceptable. That's to do with things like the availability of resources, the consequences of the functioning of the system, the morality of what is being done. So the public now has more information and increasingly is demanding sustainability of systems. And we ought to consider that, and we ought to consider what might be acceptable to other species and not just to humans. Another way of looking at this is quality of products. Quality of food now generally includes the ethics of the production method, not just the product, considering the product now, but how it's come about, and to some extent what's going to happen to it afterwards, after it's been used. And so we have a revolution in economics in the world, in that we have a change from producers pushing the economy to consumers pulling it. So this started quite a few years ago, when people started to say, well, I don't really want to buy clothing or carpets if it's being produced by child labor. And that was about 40 or 50 years ago. And that's one of the reasons why the World Trade Organization included morality of action in terms of what could be barriers to trade. As far as agricultural products are concerned, food production, 20 years ago, farmers determined almost everything about how food was produced. There were of course regulations to stop them doing some things, producing poisons and so on, or spreading diseases. But in general, they considered the methods. And what is happening now is that consumers are now exerting more and more control over the production system, or over aspects of it, which might make it an unsustainable system as far as that consumer is concerned. So what might make a production system unsustainable? What results in the quality of a product being judged as poor? Well, there are several components of sustainability. A number of these are to do with human welfare. Anything which affects human health, a key part of human welfare, could result in people not buying the product. And that's been around for quite a long time. People didn't want to buy products if it would make them sick. And that's a high priority thing, not surprisingly, for consumers. Poor welfare of animals is now a very high priority for very many consumers, and is something which can make a product unacceptable, something which they will not buy. And that is altering, therefore, how people are starting to rear the animals. And then there are things like genetic modification. There are harmful environmental effects, climate change, biodiversity reduction, pollution. And then there's the question of the efficiency of the use of world food resources. And I'll say a bit more about that in relation to some examples. As far as other human welfare areas are things like fair trade, including fair trade, that is, that you shouldn't have a product in which the producers in poor countries don't receive a fair reward for what they're doing. So there were products where large companies bought things from poor people in producing coffee or bananas or something like that, and made a lot of profit, whereas the producers made very little profit. We now have a situation where, certainly in Europe, really quite a high proportion of products have a fair trade label. That is, that there is a check that the producers are getting a reasonable return for their work, and it's not all going to some large company which doesn't put as much into it in reality. And then preserving rural communities is another issue which people are taking into account in relation to sustainability. So here are some of the components of sustainability. And clearly what we all ought to do is to consider all of the components and not just one of them. And it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to understand all the aspects of production. So you need labeling. You need some means of identifying whether things are good quality or not, whether they are sustainable or not. And so there have been sometimes people who have thought about one particular aspect of production and not worried about other things. So people think about animal welfare or greenhouse gas production or biodiversity, and they don't think about the other components of sustainability. So we need, in fact, therefore, to think with any system of production about all of the effects of a system. And we have a couple of terms which are used in these sorts of analyses: life cycle analysis and looking at the externalities of systems. So life cycle analysis means you have to think of the whole of a process, starting from the very beginning and going to the disposal of the product at the end. And you need to take account of all factors, the whole life cycle of the product. And that came about, it was a business concept. And the first, some of the early discussions about it were, well, let's think about a product which we're selling in a shop. What happens when people have finished with it? What do they do with it? If they do something with it which is damaging to the world, then that's not a good thing. And it's also applied to biological systems. So water usage and pollution and so on. So this area of life cycle analysis that has been a helpful way of analyzing what is happening. And as I said, another way of thinking of the same thing is to think in terms of externalities of the system. So a system has a particular aim, but what are all the consequences? So again, one of the earlier papers in this area looked at motor vehicle use and said not just how good is the motor vehicle, but what are all the consequences of motor vehicle use? So here are a few examples, and I'm going to pick some examples to start with: welfare and environmental effects of human activities. Here's one which is, I think most people listening to this would find it very straightforward. You produce straw when in agriculture, then you can burn it. If you burn it, that produces carbon dioxide. The amount of carbon dioxide is quite substantial. If you can do something else with it, that would be better than to burn it. And one of the things which has been done is to collect the straw and use it as an area for farm livestock to manipulate, particularly pigs. And also you can then compost it with manure and use it, and you can consider all of the consequences. So you may be able to improve the welfare of pigs and reduce the amount of environmental damage by keeping the straw and using it, for example, in this way. So here's a different example, a completely different one. Should you keep wild animals as pets, wild caught animals as pets? This is something which was analysed a few years ago by the European Food Safety Authority in relation to wild birds being caught and then brought into captivity. And it also applies to wild mammals, reptiles, fish being taken from the wild and then used as companion animals, pets. Well, what we do know is that if you take an animal from the wild and you take it into captivity, there is a very substantial negative effect on welfare. And sometimes they die quite quickly, other times they last quite a while. The analysis, just to take the bird example, the EFSA report on bringing wild birds into captivity and then eventually selling them as a pet and taking it to a different country, in this case, bringing it into the EU. One of the statistics from this was that 90% of small birds which were caught in the wild died before they were sold as a potential pet. And if it was a large, valuable bird like a parrot, then it was 70 to 80% of them died. And it also, that in part occurs because when animals are brought into captivity, it's very stressful and you get immune system function being suppressed, and the animal's much more likely to become diseased. Bad for welfare and bad for conservation then. And the reptile data is about the same. So turtles, snakes, when they're brought into captivity, they don't survive very well and their welfare is not very good. Okay, now a completely different example and relevant to one of the questions which was asked about agroforestry. In recent years, work in Colombia and Mexico and Brazil on semi-intensive 3-level silvopastoral systems has been enormously successful and is starting to change agricultural methods. So here are cattle, and there can be other animals which, instead of just getting grass, they're in a place where there are shrubs and trees with edible leaves which they can eat. That's a limited number of species which can be used. One of them is Lucina. There are a lot of one of the shrubs which you actually see in the picture is Lucina, which is a legume, high protein leaves, and so they have a high quality food. And these sorts of systems in areas where they can be managed have been economically very successful and very different from a system like a feedlot system for cattle. So the welfare of the animals is much better than even if they're just in a field. That's because of shade and choice of food and so on. And it's much more biodiverse habitat. Because it's more biodiverse, you have predators like birds and large insects which are eating ticks and flies, and therefore it reduces the amount of disease in the animals. And because it's such a productive system, the greenhouse gas production per unit of production is less. You don't need very much water to put into it. There's better soil management and better water conservation. And the total land usage is substantially less than if you only have the pasture plants. It's actually very logical that if you have food plants at 3 levels, then you have more food than if you just have grass. And yet we have round the world for a long time gone in the direction of let's just have grass and other pasture plants. Okay, here's another completely different example. How should you manage your cat? Well, some cats stay indoors a lot, and if they do go out, they don't do much damage. However, quite a lot of cats go out and kill things, and they go out and kill wild animals, mammals, birds, reptiles. They go out and kill them, and very often they torture them before they die. So they're not necessarily killing them in a way which means it's a short-term problem for the animal. On the other hand, cat welfare is improved by being able to go outside. There is a negative effect that sometimes they might be hit by motor vehicles. But if cats are not allowed to go out and roam, it's less good for the welfare of the cats, but it's much better for the welfare of the wild animals which they might otherwise have tortured and killed. So wild populations are protected by keeping them in, or if they go out, and they can go out with a mechanism like a bell or other warning to prey, and that works, then that can also be a way of solving the problem. But if the cat is going out and killing things, then I think they shouldn't be let out. They should be given an indoor environment which is adequate for them. Here's a further example of considering several different aspects, and this is looking at beef production systems. If you look at the amount of land which is used in beef production systems, then there's a lot of variation in it. And if you look at the amount of water, there's a lot of variation in it. And this is an analysis which I did on this particular subject. And this is figures for per unit of meat produced with 4 different systems. So extensive unmodified pasture, feedlot systems after different management, fertilized irrigated pasture, and semi-intensive silvopastoral systems, all for the production of beef. Now, when you look at the figures, like some which Clive quoted and which are often quoted, it seems to imply that beef is always terrible. But in terms of its sustainability and in terms of its impact on climate change, actually there's a great deal of variation depending on the system. And this is a message from this particular analysis. So this shows the analysis that was done on land area. And you can see that I've tried to count all the aspects of land area throughout the life of the animals, so including their early rearing as well as their the latter part of their lives. So right from the beginning, considering how much land is needed to produce a kilogram of beef. And what you can see here is that the extensive unmodified pasture mean was 27, whereas the silvopastoral system was 2. So that's more than 10 times as much land needed by one system than another. And the other systems were intermediate between the two. So we had more than 10-fold variance according to the system. And this is the analysis of conserved water, again, looking at all the aspects of water which are needed to produce a kilogram of beef, water drunk, what happens to water in troughs, polluted water, meat processing, irrigation of crops, which is necessarily a high thing, irrigation of pasture if it occurs. And again, you can see the figures at the bottom, there's a large variation. So it goes from 87 to 670. So more than 8 times as much water is used by some feedlot systems than is used by a well-managed silvopastoral system. So these are really large differences, and we need to look at systems. And in some cases, instead of saying don't eat beef, it's eat beef, which is not as bad as the worst system. So how do we actually decide? We're going to come back to the beef, but how do we actually decide about which systems are the worst or the best? We need to measure all aspects of sustainability, and an index of sustainability is then needed. This is a comparison looking at the two figures I just mentioned, which is total land area used and water usage, and also the other aspects, including the welfare of animals in beef production. And these were the figures for how much the system was unsustainable. And you can see that extensive grazing with degraded pasture was a bad system. Feedlots and indoor rearing are bad systems, but extensive grazing when the pasture is not degraded is very much better. Fertilized irrigated pasture with no concentrates is very much better, and where you can do it, the silvopastoral systems work the best. So there can be a big variation then, and we need to do proper analyses of all systems in order to work out what are the best things to do. Okay, so how difficult or expensive is it for products to be good quality, for the systems to be sustainable? Extensive sheep and beef can easily have good welfare at little cost. I'm just giving some welfare examples here. I can't really go into everything. Farmed fish, if you limit stocking density and you have good management, then you can have good welfare of farmed fish, but in other circumstances it's not very good. If you slow down broiler growth, then the welfare of the broilers is enormously better than if the broilers are growing at the maximum possible speed. If you reduce the stocking density of pigs, you can greatly improve the welfare of the pigs. Dairy cows, if you go for high milk yield, then you tend to get a lot of lameness, mastitis, and reproductive disorders. So we shouldn't have high yielding dairy cows. And that's revolution to a lot of people in the dairy industry, but just on animal welfare grounds. But we should look at all of the aspects. And consumers, of course, are already starting to refuse to buy animals where they think they're not produced very well. and people are taking account of other things. So the amount of greenhouse gas, that's also something where we can do something about it. I'll come back to that later. And we need to be able to improve resource usage. So how do we compare systems, and what could we actually do? Well, here are some of the things you can do, and you've heard this already from Clive Phillips. So eat less meat. And the most important thing is that we shouldn't be producing meat where we could have eaten what those animals were eating. And in terms of using the resources of the world, we ought to focus on animals which eat things that we can't eat. And that might be insects, and it might be vegetarian farmed fish, but it might also be animals eating pasture plants. Eating pasture plants is much better than animals which are eating maize, other grains, soya, because they're using the world resources much more efficiently. So otherwise we should be eating the grains and soya ourselves and not eating the meat. So if we're going to eat meat, we should eat animals which are eating things we don't eat. And that would mean especially eating herbivorous animals, mammals, fish, mollusks, insects, whichever, the different kinds of farming systems. And we need, so that's a general guidance thing, but in many cases, what we practically have to do is to have a label saying whether it's sustainable, and that label ought to cover all the aspects. So who has to change, and how will that come about? Well, every producer of food needs to consider sustainability now before they're forced to do it by the public stopping purchasing what they are producing. We should stop wasteful production. We should stop production which involves environmental damage. We need to manage soils better. We should not have any farming practice which damages soil, and that should have a higher penalty than it has at the moment. People are at the moment allowed to go into places, damage the soil, go on to the next place and damage the soil. That should be a criminal offence. And it's more relevant in areas where soil degradation or soil blowing away is a major problem. We should use systems like the semi-intensive silvopastoral systems when they can be used. And we need to develop systems that reduce carbon footprint and reduce greenhouse gases. And we can do that in part by changing the diet. And there was a question about doing that. If you feed certain kinds of seaweed to ruminants, then you can reduce the amount of methane which is produced by the ruminants. You can reduce the total greenhouse gas output from that kind of farming system. You can't at the moment reduce it to nothing. You can reduce it maybe by 20%, 30%, but that may well improve. So there are various additives, and seaweed is one, which can mean that ruminant animals are producing less methane. Then we need to be doing something in order to reduce the risk of more new diseases. Again, we've had a little discussion about that already from Clive Phillips. So what do we actually have to do? I've just been involved in producing a large paper on this, and it hasn't come out yet. We need to reduce and control direct contact with wild animals and their products. And so that is partly think about whether you're going to allow bushmeat, the consumption of the meat of wild animals. In some cases you will, because it may well be that for an area that producing deer or producing a wild animal is an efficient way to exploit that area for human food, but other things are being eaten which are not at all efficient to eat, and that probably needs regulation in every country. Also, we need to think about the trade of wild animal products. So at present, there is export and commercial trade in animal products, and this is one of the reasons why the COVID-19 outbreak occurred. So as you've heard, the virus almost certainly came from bats in the first instance. It came probably from horseshoe bats of one species or another, and that those bats were disturbed, or they were captured and then sold, and they probably were transported with something else. It may well be they were transported with pangolins, because there's a big trade in pangolins for traditional Chinese medicine. In fact, China seems to be stopping the trade, which is a good thing for the pangolins, but also a good thing for disease in China. So we need to have better regulation. In some cases, we shouldn't allow the transport and trade in wild animal products, but it should certainly be regulated. It needs to be better regulation, and there should be a regulation on the breeding and rearing and trade in wild animals, and also domesticated animals, because some of the spread of diseases has occurred because domesticated animal and their products are being taken around the world legally and illegally, and that is causing spread of various diseases. So how do you bring about the change? Well, individual consumers can do something by deciding what they buy and what they don't buy, but other things, you can't just leave it to a commercial market. It has to be regulated by individual national governments and by international agencies. So to move towards more sustainable systems, we need to have control by governments. Needs to be a lot of control, and that control should be calculated on the basis of the international situation and not just a national situation. So governments ought to consider world effects of what they're doing, not just short-term national interests or short-term interests of particular commercial companies, and not just short-term political interests. This is a hopeful thing, I know, but politicians should be thinking further ahead. So we do need laws to control our interactions with non-human animals, to preserve the world environment, and we need to preserve the whole world environment and not just the environment that humans use. So we shouldn't have laws which are too human-centered, too selfish. We should think about the whole world and not just about humans. And so this is really a change in philosophy, and there needs to be a change in philosophy for very many people in the world. There have to be some more restrictions on human action, restrictions on commercial action, and some of these are really urgent. They need to be done very quickly. What we can see is that where countries work together, good change is more likely to occur. And this has been very clearly demonstrated within the EU, that the EU has been a force for good in many ways, because you've got 28 countries all talking to one another and then coming to a conclusion. And the same has applied in a number of other trading groups around the world which have occurred. And so there's a greater chance of something which is good for the whole world if several countries are talking to one another. Corruption hinders progress in all these areas. So we have a situation where there are animals being transported for medicine in China, or something which is considered a delicacy in some particular country, which is illegal, but it's still happening. And so enforcing the law is important, and having a government which does that is important. UN agencies have had a very useful effect. They need more strength. Okay, so that's what we have to do, but how long have we got to do it? Well, welfare changes, most of the changes, I mentioned several of them, can be implemented quite quickly, in a few months or a few years. So we can change things fairly quickly, and it isn't going to put farmers out of business to do it. It may make them change a bit what they're doing, but it doesn't put them out of business altogether. But we do need to have very rapid change to improve some aspects of sustainability. We already have extensive loss of life in the world, extinction of species, large numbers of individual deaths of animals occurring, and some very simple human actions can be changed. For example, if there is an area of bush, woodland, and you knock it down by bringing a large heavy chain across the whole of the land, that kills a lot of things very quickly. There are other ways to do it which don't kill animals and don't kill plants as quickly. And some of the changes for climate change are needed before they become irreversible. We probably have some things which are already irreversible, but we need rapid action to do something about it. so we do actually need a large change in what we eat and what we produce. And I very much agree with what Clive said about cell cultured meat. Cell cultured meat is going to be an important thing in the future and is generally going to be an improvement. But it really is the case that consumers are changing faster than producers, and producers need to be looking ahead more than they are. So we have a situation at the moment then where there's a rapid loss of lives, there's extinction of species, and then for each person you have to say, is that important? Is it an important issue that we are doing this damage to the world at large when some of the damage is not to humans but to other species? And is that an important issue to you? And there are some of the books in which I've written about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donald, for your presentation. We have some questions for you in the Q&A box. So the first, can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
So the first is from Justina, and she says, shouldn't we turn the question of the division into legitimate and unjustified harm to animals into the question of justifying harm to humans, air, environment, and climate by the economic interest of a narrow interest group?
I think we should narrow interest groups. There's always a risk if you have a narrow interest that you will do something which is relevant to that interest but isn't necessarily the best thing to do overall. So there can be problems of there being narrow interest groups, and we ought to be thinking about wider issues. I think it is the case that we often don't think about things in a broad enough way, but what is the best mechanism for doing something about it? That's a major political question. But I do think that every individual person can do something to improve the world. Each of us can change. We can change what we say to other people, and how we say it. Obviously, you should say it in a way which is constructive and not just condemning. And we can change what we purchase, and we can tell the people from whom we purchase things why we are not buying things. So everybody can actually do something, but some things really need to be done by governments, and that needs to be done at a different level.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Dora Marinova. She says, thanks, Donald. I used to have 3 chickens when I was young and they could recognize me. All 3 had different personalities. How would you comment on ag laws that stop people from reporting how chicken are being treated in factory farms?
Yeah. So there should not be any law which stops people from pointing out something which is morally wrong. It depends how you do it. So if your response to thinking that something is wrong is to blow them up with a bomb, then that has negative consequences. But if your response is to say it and to present it to the world in legal ways, then that's a good thing. But I don't think it is, to me, it's not acceptable to have a law which says you cannot say that somebody else is doing something which is immoral. The thing which would be wrong would be to use a method which is probably damaging to your own cause and damaging to other individuals as well. So, but I know that there are these laws in some states in the USA, and that they are, and it seems to me iniquitous that such a law can be passed. It depends a bit on how it's worded, but so I think that if you think that something is wrong about a factory farm, then you should always be able to say that. And in fact, you always can say it in some ways. I think it's important to say it, but probably the greatest strength you have is in your role as a consumer, and say, right, I personally won't buy it. I will tell other people that I'm not buying it, and I will write and tell people why I'm not buying it. And those are the things which are, those are strong actions, in fact.
Okay, next question from Justina Zulinska. What is your opinion on the rotten compromise on the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy voted last week in the European Parliament? What can we do so that the farm to fork strategy can be fully implemented in the European Union agricultural policy?
Well, I don't know exactly what was voted on last week, but I know that there were some proposals which were not very positive. What has been happening in recent years is that as far as animal welfare was concerned, there was a lot of progress in legislation within the EU, and which very often has been followed up in other countries, or indeed preceded in some cases in other countries. So it is a worldwide area, but then there has been some sort of reaction against this, saying we've gone too fast and we should slow down in some respects. And so I regret that, because I think that the progress was actually has actually been to go in the right direction. But it certainly is the case that, I mean, I wrote a report for the European Parliament on what has been happening and what should happen in the future in terms of animal welfare legislation, which came out 2 years ago. And we still have a lot of major problems, and we don't have legislation in a number of those areas. So, for example, dairy cattle, there's no directive in the EU on dairy cattle welfare. There really ought to be, but the consumers are just starting to do something about it. But that is, they're starting to say, I don't want to buy products if the welfare of the dairy cows is so bad. But I think that we do need what is being decided in the last weeks is partly a reaction to the results of elections in several member states and to what the UK has done, which is the most extreme thing. And so there seems to have been a political move which has driven these changes, and I regret some of those changes, although as I say, I don't know all the details because I haven't read it all.
Okay, next one. How do you deal with the biggest problem of consumers not knowing or trusting food labels?
Yes, I think the answer is you need to have laws about labeling, and you need then to have people demanding labeling. So if you have good quality labeling, then consumers can readily decide, I'll buy this and I won't buy that. So that is probably the main answer to the question. I think the question was about labeling, wasn't it?
Yes.
Food labels, yes. So then the question is who wrote the label? So we have situations where industry groups, in not just in food production but in other areas, they write labels, and those labels are not, in fact, they're misleading, and it happens in all countries. I mean, Clive Phillips mentioned dairy production in China. I remember going to a dairy farm in China, and around the edge of the dairy farm there was a large fence, and on the outside of the fence were lots of pictures of cows in fields. But inside the dairy farm there weren't any cows in fields. They were all in yards. But of course the people who were doing this are well aware that they want to create an image with the public, and so there are pictures on animal products which look as though the animals are being kept in one condition when actually they're kept in another condition. So that actually shouldn't be. We need to have laws on how to do the labeling. Actually, there are laws in the EU about the labeling of a number of products, and that's a good thing. But there needs to be more. And then the question is who actually ensures that what it says on the label is correct. Well, you have to have inspection, and the inspection, some of these successful schemes have been run by an animal protection society on behalf of a commercial company, perhaps a supermarket, like the Freedom Food Scheme, which was started by the RSPCA in the UK. And So that means that you have a label which is supported by an organization which you trust. But what has tended to happen more and more is that the retail companies themselves are putting out their own labels, and they can't afford to lie, because if they're found out, then somebody may go to another supermarket chain instead of to theirs. And so in general, the enforcement of food labeling has been done particularly by the supermarket companies, the retail companies, not the producers, the retailers. And the retailers generally get it right, and they generally have far more inspectors than government has, and therefore that has worked quite well. And so generally speaking, labeling put out by a company which can't afford to get it wrong is more likely to be reliable. But labeling by the people who produce it, if you have a law which says you're not allowed to say something which is a lie, then that's a good thing. And sometimes will restrict people from saying things which are actually untrue, and because it can be challenged in the courts. So you can trust some labels better than others, but I agree very much that labeling is a key part of the future for consumers to be able to decide what to buy.
Okay, we have 2 more questions actually. Let's see if we can answer them in time. So the first one is from Nancy Clark, that is rather general. So what are the arguments for and against aiming to completely replace animal forms of protein with alternative plant-based and cell culture proteins?
So I think that it's very good to encourage people to take more plant protein, to more plant-based food, and we all ought to be doing that, and it shouldn't be regarded as an indicator of success in society to say I eat lots of meat, and that is something which really does exist in very many societies. So we ought to be reducing, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should replace all the meat, because we actually, in order to, 42% of all the land which is used on the Earth's surface is suitable for growing plants, pasture plants, but not suitable for growing crops. So if we stop using that completely, although that would be good in the sense that there would be more nature reserves, we would have a good deal less food available. So I think that in order to use large areas of the world for food production, that we need to have animals which can consume what is grown there, and that means leaves. So it means pasture plants, leaves of shrubs and trees. And in the future, we should have some of that, and not just plant-based material which we can eat. Otherwise, we would need to use, we would have to have more intensive farming of cereals and soya and so on. And I think that's undesirable. So I think the best balance for the future is a reduction in animal, the amount of meat which is being eaten, and to some extent dairy, but not a replacement altogether. So that's talking at a global level, and there are some other individual points to make, but that would be my general answer to the question, but very interesting question.
And the final question is from Alejandra Norniela Monachi. And she asks if you believe possible to add as, I think she means a subject in school, of animal welfare and sustainability in schools, university, every scholar period, to all students from kids to teenagers.
Well, it happens that this morning I was just talking to somebody who has just set up a charity to try to increase education about sustainability in schools and in universities, to make good quality information available which can be used. So people are thinking about these things. There really has been a substantial change in what is taught. I remember about when I was, so my job for a long time was Professor of Animal Welfare, and there was a video made 30 years ago with the aim of showing it in schools, because the curriculum in schools said that they needed to understand animal behavior. And so what they put into this little video was, here is the behavior of animals, isn't it remarkable? And also, here are systems which you can use which don't cause behavior disorders in animals. And that was seen by the majority of school children in Britain, this little video. And probably, as far as I'm personally concerned, the most valuable thing I've ever done was to contribute to this video, which was set up by Audrey Ayton in order that it would go to schools. And then there was some more done later, and several other animal welfare researchers contributed to it. So we do need to provide good quality scientific information, and which, however, can be understood at different age levels. And I think that's a really important thing to do. And so how do you do it? You make sure, if there is a national curriculum, you put some words in the national curriculum which encourage it. And so I think that's probably the way forward, but you do need to have information which is suitable for the audience. So if it's for 8-year-old children, it's obviously different from what it would be for 14-year-old children and for adults. So you need good information presented in a good way, school books and videos and other material which is suitable for education. And in the future, the biggest changes are going to occur because of what the current school children are doing. And it's very noticeable in a number of countries that a lot of the biodiversity campaign is being organized by very young people. And on the whole, they're using proper information. So they need to have access to good information, and they need to be people who are in all age groups who are trying to present that information. And it needs to be presented in such a way that nobody reacts against it and says that's extremist nonsense. It's got to be credible.
Good. We have another question, actually. I think we still can answer that. So Bianca Van Dressen asks you if, regarding diminishing the concept of superiority of humans over animals, we can notice less distance between human and companion animals. For instance, many people are considering pets as family members and treating them likewise. Do you believe that this perception of pets in the family can be positive to diminish the concept of superiority of humans over other animals as well, like farm animals?
I think that, I mean, I've worked for a long time in a veterinary department, and it's very noticeable that in the veterinary profession, that the people who are working especially with companion animals and talking regularly to those who interact frequently with companion animals are very sympathetic to animal welfare problems. Not always to all of them, so we still have dog breeds which have terrible welfare problems, but I think it is the case that quite a lot of people have changed their ideas about how animals function because of the interactions they have with their pets. And it is well known that there have been good studies done by Joan Serpell, Anthony Podbesek, Liz Paul and others showing that the education of that where people have had pets in their childhood, they are more likely to be interested in sustainability in general, animal welfare, biodiversity. They're more likely to be interested in those things. So early experiences with companion animals do have the potential to have a beneficial effect. But then at the same time, we've still got a significant increase in the number of people who are buying pugs, French bulldogs, animals which have almost all of them serious respiratory problems, serious animal welfare problems. So not everybody gets the message, but a proportion of people do. And I think that actually thinking of farm animals as individuals which are actually very clever and well organized individuals has been something which has changed the thinking of many people in the world. And people would often have said, well, I know that my dog is clever, but obviously a pig or a sheep isn't clever. But actually, when you look at it, you find that pigs and sheep are at least as clever as dogs, and therefore they ought to be respected. And that respect does tend to change the way that people behave. There was one question asked to Clive, which I might just make a comment on, and that was about spirulina, about alternative kinds of foods. And I think that's a very important thing, which Clive did mention in general terms, that we ought to think about plant-derived foods. I mean, this is a cyanobacterium which produces something which can certainly be used as a food source, as a source of particular nutrients. And I think that actually looking for new plant-based food sources is an important thing to do. I just wanted to mention that because it was a question which was specifically asked earlier.
Yeah. Okay, so I think if there are no questions, we can end the webinar here. If you have more questions, you can also email them to the conference email and we will pass them to the speakers. But before we go, I would like to thank once again to Professor Donald Broom and Clive Phillips. And I hope you enjoyed the webinar. If you have any comments as well, you can email us, and because we are interested on what you think about this live session.
Thank you for chairing, and thank you very much for organizing. Thanks to all the organizers of this event. It's been very nice to be part of it. Thank you.
Okay, so bye-bye and take care.